I know this is going to be a little different than our typical sermons, but once every quarter I do something different. Could be about a current event, could be a question and answer sermon, and that's today. So, I sent out in the weekly email a trivia question. We're going to have a bunch more trivia questions, and we're going to start with one right now. Put your devices away, no Googling, all right? What major lunar event happened on December 14th, 1972? Anybody have any idea? No. I guess? What's that? Halley's Comet. That would have been in the 80s. You're close. Maybe early 90s. I think the last time Halley's Comet came was around 88, 89. On December 14th, 1972, U.S. astronaut Gene Cernan stepped off the surface of the moon, climbed up the ladder into the lunar module named Challenger, closed the hatch, blasted off, and returned to Earth, and humans have never again set foot on the moon. That was 52 years ago. Though we haven't gone back to the moon, humanity has been exploring space nonstop ever since. Nations and companies, as Debbie indicated, have spent so much money on space exploration. Debbie used an M for millions. You can change that not just to a B, but to a T, with trillions of dollars have been spent. Is it worth it? And what would God have to say about it? Today we're going to look at what the Bible has to say about space exploration. But before we can examine what the Bible has to say about space exploration, we have to answer an important question. What is space exploration? And even before we can answer that, we have to answer what is space? And that leads us to my second trivia question. What is space? How do you know if you've gotten to space? There's actually a line. Does anyone know what it's called? No? The space line? That would be a good guess, but there was probably someone who made that claim, and the last name of that person was Kármán. The Kármán line is the boundary between Earth's atmosphere and space. It is 62 miles above land, above sea distance. And that's where space begins. And therefore, space exploration started when the first humans crossed that line. It was in the middle of World War II. Can you take a guess who did it first? The Nazis. They sent a V-2 rocket on October 3rd, 1942, the first man-made object to ever cross the Kármán line, and space exploration began. Now, the foremost Nazi rocket scientist, actually, there's another trivia question. Anybody have a clue what his name was? Very famous. You got it. Who said that in the back there? Thank you, Steve. Well done. Wernher von Braun. He surrendered to American troops right near the end of the war and began helping the United States military with rocket development. And he would be instrumental in the U.S. space program. But it wasn't the Americans who would lead the way in the early years of space exploration. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first satellite into orbit around the Earth. Anybody know what that satellite was called? Now we're getting a little closer, a little more famous. Sputnik. It kind of looked like a chrome beach ball with 4 antennae sticking out of it. And if you turned it over on its side, it almost looked like a spider. Giant circle spider. A month later, the Soviets sent the first living creature into space. Does anybody know what that was? A monkey, right? This was the era of the Cold War. And it was that epic battle between democracy, America and our allies, and communism, the Soviet Union and China and their allies. So, with Sputnik and the monkey, the Soviets scored the first point in this battle of space exploration. So, not to be outdone, the United States, we launched our first satellite in 1958, January 31st. Does anybody remember what that was called? This one is a little bit tougher. Mercury? Nope. Mercury would have been a name of the rockets that launched. This was called Explorer 1. 6 months later, on July 28th, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was formed. We know that as NASA. And with that, the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union was on. And over the next few years, it seemed that the Soviets were beating the Americans at every single turn. The Soviets were the first to launch a satellite, the first human into Earth. Anyone know his name? Yuri Gagarin. That's right, April 12th, 1961. They were beating the US every time, and we were chasing them. A month later, we sent the first American into space on May 5th. Who was that? John Glenn is a great guess. He's about to come next, but he was not the first American in space. Alan Shepard. Shepard made it to space, but he didn't even orbit the Earth. In fact, Yuri Gagarin had done that with the Russians the previous year, so we didn't even match them. It wasn't until February 20th, 1962, that the first American... No? I said it before. John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth. Then on September 12th, 1962, U.S. President John F. Kennedy at the time made his famous declaration, "We choose to go to the moon." And with that, he began a concerted effort for the United States to land humans on the moon and return them safely back to Earth before 1970. Well, the Soviets were thinking the same thing. And so began the space race to get to the moon. Over the next 3 years, the Soviets continued to beat us. First woman in space, 1963. First multi-human space flight, 1964. First spacewalk, 1965. The U.S. would hit all those milestones in 1965, except for one. Can you guess which one that we didn't do? First woman in space. Who knows why? We wouldn't do that till 20 years after the Russians. 1983. And what was her name? Sally Ride. Sally Ride. But go back to 1966. The Soviets were just beating us every single turn. And they hit another major milestone first when they launched and landed an unmanned spacecraft on the surface of the moon. As if coming in second place wasn't bad enough to the Russians all those years, in 1967, NASA suffered a terrible loss when the rocket, which would later become known as Apollo 1, caught fire on the launch pad and 3 U.S. astronauts were killed. Prior to the disaster of Apollo 1, the United States program was trailing the Soviets, but we were always just keeping pace. We were making a number of accomplishments, and we actually notched a few firsts. For example, we had Gemini missions. That was one of the names for the launch program. They were the first to perform orbital docking procedures. We did beat the Russians to that. But after that Apollo disaster on the launch pad, the program to launch Apollo rockets, the huge rockets that were supposed to take astronauts to the moon, it was shut down for 18 months. And so in September 1968, the USSR scored another major victory, sending an unmanned spaceship to the moon's orbit, around the moon, and safely back to Earth. And so with the space program, the US space program grounded, and with the Soviets making numerous advances to the moon, it seemed just a matter of time until a cosmonaut would be the first to walk on the moon. But NASA had been working hard behind the scenes. They had been testing, they had been fixing, they had been test launching numerous Apollo rockets. And in what is known as moonshot, NASA made a gutsy push to beat the Soviets real quick. On October 11th, 1968, the first manned Apollo mission was successful. On December 24th, 1968, just a few months later, NASA scored major points in the space race, sending the first manned Apollo mission to orbit the moon and successfully return to Earth. At the same time, just as the American moonshot was achieving all of these successes, the Soviet space program hit a major struggle. In early July 1969, their unmanned moon rocket exploded just after launch. So after years, over a decade of playing catch-up to the Soviets, NASA was suddenly ahead. And we struck the final blow. July 16th, 1969, landing humans on the moon. And that was Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. The United States would go on to launch 6 more Apollo missions to the moon, landing 5 times on the moon. The exception was the famous Apollo 13, which had complications mid-journey to the moon, and they actually used the moon's gravity to slingshot around the moon and return safely back to the Earth. And during those years, 1969 to 1972, the Soviets had no response. And so, on December 14th, 1972, when U.S. astronaut Cernan left the moon on Apollo 17, the United States had clearly defeated the Soviets in the space race. The space race was over, at least to get to the moon, but exploration was far from over. The USSR started diverting its attention to building space stations that it launched, really small space stations, a number of them over the next 10 years, primarily for military purposes. The United States did the same. Do you remember the name of the first US space station? Skylab. It was bigger than the Soviet stations. It could hold more people. It could do more science, and it was there a lot longer. But it took the retirement of those huge Apollo rockets to get the Skylab station into orbit. And NASA was really evaluating the cost, the loss of life, the impression of the American public. Do we really need to spend this much money in this, what amounted to be a battle with the Soviets? And so they were looking for a transport system because they still wanted to explore space that would be reusable and much more cost-effective. And they developed something called the Space Transport System. You and I know it much more familiarly as the Space Shuttle. Development began in 1972, and the first shuttle mission blasted off April 12, 1981. Over the next 30 years, NASA would build 6 space shuttles, using them for zero-gravity experimentation, deploying satellites, building the International Space Station, and launching the Hubble Space Telescope. Sadly, 2 of the 6 shuttles and their crews were lost to disaster. You remember the first one? The name? Challenger. January 28th, 1986. I was a kid, 6th grade, and that one hit me hard. I came in from recess. I'll never forget this. Some of you maybe feel this way about the John F. Kennedy shooting. Some of you remember this about the September 11th. I remember it just as well about the Challenger disaster. I'd been out in recess, came inside from recess, and a kid in school had drawn on the chalkboard a little rudimentary picture of the space shuttle blowing up. We were shocked. In the days leading up to the launch, we'd been so excited because there was a special passenger on the Challenger mission. Do you remember her name? Krista McAuliffe. And what was so special about her? She was a school teacher. She was a social studies teacher from New Hampshire. She was going to be the first private citizen in space. She was going to teach lessons that were going to be broadcast by satellite to schools all over the country. And I'll never forget walking by my school's library where they had the satellite link-up station that you could see. We were so excited about this. And then it exploded during liftoff. I don't know about you. I know we've talked about this over the years. Many of you are vivid nighttime dreamers. Me too. I had so many nightmares about the space shuttle after that time. It hit me. Something about space and space exploration gets inside our hearts and minds, some of us. Some of you may be listening today like, what is going on here? The space shuttle program was on hold for 32 months after that point. Loads of investigations and testing and fixing and so on. But on September 29th, 1988, Space Shuttle mission STS-26 relaunched the program. By that time, I was now in high school. I remember watching live on television with the rest of one of my classes, praying, literally, I kid you not, praying, Lord, may this go well, may this go well, may this go well. I was having high anxiety about it. And we breathed a sigh of relief when the mission went off as planned. But 15 years later, February 1st, 2003, I was youth pastor here at Faith Church at the time. We had taken a group of youth group students. I don't know if any of you would have been a part of that. Maybe Brandon and Kristen, I'm not sure. We went to Water Street Rescue Mission to serve there. I remember we were sorting clothes in their clothing room, and they had the television on. We learned that another space shuttle, Columbia, it broke up during re-entry. And between those two shuttle disasters, 14 astronauts lost their lives. But they did more investigation, more testing, more fixing, and the shuttle program launched again, and it continued until July 2011. How many of you remember the shuttle was flying that long? The shuttles flew a total of 135 missions. But the problem is that even though they were reusable, they were still extremely expensive, and when you add to that the loss of life, it was unfathomable. And so in 2011, NASA shut down the shuttle program, and you'd think, given the cost of life and the cost of the program, that our fascination with outer space exploration might be starting to take a dive. Not even close. Long before that last shuttle mission was taking place in 2011, a shift had been underway. Private companies began to take an interest in space exploration. In fact, SpaceX, one of those private companies owned by Elon Musk, started in 2002. 10 years later, in 2012, SpaceX flew its first astronauts to the International Space Station. And since that time, SpaceX's growth has been extraordinary. It's famous for its rockets that land back on the ground straight up and down. Maybe you've seen the video on the news or watched it on YouTube. They sometimes even land their rockets on boats in water. It's pretty impressive. Well, these advancements have allowed SpaceX to fly far more inexpensively than any government or company before it. As of today, I just looked on their website, SpaceX has launched 374 times. 339 of those times, they've landed the rocket safely so they can be used again. And in fact, 308 of SpaceX's launches are using rockets that have flown before. Last week, one of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rockets broke the record for the most launches on the same rocket, 22 times. Maybe you're asking yourself, what in the world is SpaceX doing launching so many rockets? Last year, calendar year 2023, they launched 100 times. Well, by far, most of their rockets are payloads from private companies that want to send up satellites all around the world, or their own satellites, which SpaceX has been sending up to create a network of satellites to provide internet around the globe called Starlink. But they also send supply missions and astronauts to the International Space Station. But SpaceX has set its sights well beyond the space station. Over the last few years, it has built the biggest rocket in history. It's called the Super Heavy. They've also built a new reusable spaceship that they call Starship. Starship is larger than the space shuttle, and it's designed to take payloads and humans not only to the moon, but also to Mars. The shuttle, you might remember, would be hooked onto the back of a rocket. Starship sits on top of a rocket. And when it launches, the rocket, Super Heavy, separates and is caught on the ground by this giant structure called Mechazilla that has these arms. Now they're still perfecting this, but the rocket will come down and the Mechazilla will catch it with these arms before it crashes to the ground. Starship will fly, and it will not land like a shuttle. The shuttle landed like an airplane. Starship will land up and down like SpaceX's other rockets. Speaking of Mars, since NASA got out of the space shuttle business, it's still been involved in all sorts of missions. It sends out exploratory probes and vehicles all around the solar system and beyond. Maybe you've seen some of the close-up photos of Jupiter, of its moons, of Saturn, of even other asteroids. Perhaps you've watched video of the robot rovers on Mars, and most recently the one mission sent a robot helicopter to Mars, where they've been flying a helicopter on the surface of Mars. We're now able to see high-definition pictures of Mars. It's unbelievable. So in recent years, NASA is looking again toward landing humans on the moon and eventually Mars. And to do this, NASA created its own mega rocket, the Space Launch System. Space Launch System last year launched an unmanned mission that flew to the moon, circled around it, and came back using its new Orion spacecraft. And these missions, no longer called Apollo, they're called Artemis, which is the video that we showed you to begin the worship service with. Artemis will eventually attempt to land astronauts on the moon, probably combining with SpaceX's Starship to do that. There is so much more happening in space. I could go on and on and on. Countries and private companies across the globe are working on all sorts of technologies to explore space. They're trying to find water on the moon. They're trying to find minerals on asteroids. And did you hear the news this past week that scientists believe there is a massive ocean under the surface of Mars? The United States, on Christmas Day 2021, launched the James Webb Space Telescope to give us high-definition pictures further into the galaxies and the universe than ever before. And then came the billionaires. The founder of Amazon, billionaire Jeff Bezos, started a space tourism company. Does anybody know what it's called? Blue Origin. And they use a spaceship called the New Shepard, named after Alan Shepard. Their spaceship travels just past that Kármán line so that passengers can actually go to space. That's no big deal, considering that governments have broken the Kármán line since the 1960s. But what is new is that anyone can pay for a ticket and ride on the New Shepard. That is, if you have the $1.25 million for a ticket. Or you can go the bargain route. You can fly on Richard Branson's bargain spaceflight company, Virgin Galactic, and their space plane for only $450,000 a ticket. Apparently, the waiting lists are super long, so you better get on that. But another private company has been trying to get into the space race as well. It's a company that has been having a lot of troubles lately. Boeing. Remember the jet that had a door pop off mid-flight? Remember the video of airplanes taking off and wheels flying off those airplanes? It's happened twice to Boeing in the last couple years. Remember their jet, the 737 MAX, that had 2 disasters and 346 people were killed? That Boeing. Boeing has needed a win. Earlier this year, Boeing finally got their win. But it wasn't a jetliner. It was Starliner, their spaceship. It launched on June 5th, 2024, and aboard Starliner were 2 NASA astronauts, Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams. They docked at the International Space Station on June 6th on a NASA mission that was supposed to have them there for 8 days. And then they were going to return home on Starliner. Boeing's big win turned into a loss almost immediately. Starliner had problems during its flight and docking at the International Space Station. Because as you can imagine, and maybe you've all seen this before, spaceships have 2 major ways to move around. Their primary thrust engine, which shoots them up really fast and powerfully, then a whole bunch of smaller thrusters which guide them in their movements. It's like a steering wheel. Those small steering thrusters malfunctioned on Starliner. You got to be able to steer. And so, Boeing and NASA extended the astronauts' stay for a few days while they evaluated whether or not the Starliner was safe to fly home. That was 2 months ago, and they're still there on the International Space Station. This past week, we learned that the astronauts might not even return until February, and probably not on Starliner. Instead, SpaceX might come to their rescue, making seats available for them to return home. If that's what happens, what was supposed to have been an 8-day stay on the International Space Station will have turned into 8 months. Can you imagine? Can you imagine being their families on Earth? Thankfully, there is excellent communication between the International Space Station and Earth, and so the families are able to be in touch. But still, I wonder, 8 days, 8 months? What in the world? This is the kind of situation that can cause us to question whether all this emphasis on space exploration is worth it. And rightly so. It's not just the fact that there are 2 astronauts who are stranded in space. Consider literally the trillions of dollars that have been spent. Consider the loss of life over the years. Consider the toll that spaceflight takes on humans. Zero gravity, there's radiation. Not to mention the question of why. Why are we even doing this? Why go to places like the moon and Mars that are literally inhospitable to human life? Is it really worth it? Many have argued very intensely that God would not approve of space travel. So what does God think? And does the Bible have anything to say about it? Well, first of all, we have to go back to the beginning. Genesis chapter 1. In the creation story, we read that what God created is good. Think about the goodness of creation from a cosmic perspective. Think about the fact that the Earth's orbit around the sun is located in what is called the hospitable zone, or the habitable zone. The definition of the habitable zone is the distance from a star that a planet can have liquid water on its surface. You get too close to the sun, you burn up. Too far away, you freeze. Earth is the perfect distance for life. We also know that without the sun, we would be in bad shape. The sun provides light and heat, and that makes life possible on our planet. So praise God for that. We also have the perfect satellite, the moon. On their website, NASA says the moon makes Earth a more livable planet by moderating our home planet's wobble on its axis, leading to a relatively stable climate. It also causes tides, creating a rhythm that has guided humans for thousands of years. When humans have traveled into space, and this has been an experience that has been renewed through the efforts of space tourism because so many more people are actually getting to see this, they are overcome with emotion at seeing the grandeur of the Earth from above. Astronauts remark that all the wars, the political strife, the racism, the hate make such little sense when viewing our incredible planet from above. So there's a sense in which we can view the goodness of creation by looking upward away from it. Looking upward can help us to have a better view of what's happening all around us here. Space exploration, therefore, can help humanity have a much healthier view of creation's intent. We appreciate the Earth more when we know how incredibly unique Earth is. We can be grateful for the amazing gift of the Earth, and we can be motivated to care for the Earth which is exactly what God has called humans to do. Go back to Genesis 1:28. God calls humans to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. That is not a call to destroy the earth, but to make it a place of flourishing. Furthermore, in Genesis 2, verse 15, God calls human to work the land of the garden and care for it. This may sound totally counterintuitive, but by exploring space, we have been, as humans, oftentimes very motivated to care for the earth. I'm going to talk about this more in just a moment, but space exploration has been a huge motivation to help for creation care. Now, I am not certain where to draw the line. How much space exploration is too much? How much cost is too much? It is theoretically possible that we could spend so much money exploring space that we don't have the resources to care for Earth properly. And so we need to be guarded about this. Should we give NASA a blank check every year in the government's budget? I don't know. Last year, $73 billion was NASA's budget. That could be used for a lot of good stuff here on Earth, right? Like I said in the weekly email, think about what $73 billion could do for poverty, homelessness, energy, food, clean water, disease, and so on. I don't know where to draw the line. The Bible doesn't tell us. But perhaps we can take a viewpoint that we can do both. We can be a society that is extremely focused on caring for the very real needs here on Earth, and we can be a society that also looks to the heavens to explore space at the same time. Some might respond that because the cost of exploring space is exponentially greater and riskier than exploring Earth, we shouldn't explore space. Some believe that there's a line of viability and exploring space has crossed that line decades ago. They would say that exploring space is actually detrimental to human flourishing. Instead, they would say it is more in line with God's heart for humans to care for the earth in a sustainable way. Imagining if all those billions of dollars were put to good use here. We're talking about stewardship, really. A steward is one who cares for the property of another. So think about the earth and ourselves as stewards. In Deuteronomy 10:14 we read this, "To the Lord your God belong the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth, and everything in it." So when we think about space exploration and Earth, we are thinking about caring for or stewarding someone else's property. It's God's property. It's not ours. What is good stewardship of our planet, of its resources, of the people that live on our planet? Now perhaps that phrase, you ever heard this before? That person is so heavenly minded, they're of no earthly good. It might fit in this situation. Usually that phrase refers to Christians who focus so much on eternal life that they neglect God's heart for human flourishing in the here and now on earth. We can certainly focus both on eternal life and abundant life at the same time. The problem is so often we focus so much on eternal life that we neglect abundant life. So if we take that phrase, they are so heavenly minded, they are of no earthly good, and we apply it to space exploration, we could say that all that money that was used for the Apollo missions, all that money that was used for the space shuttle missions, all that money that has been used for all kinds of space exploration could have better been used to alleviate poverty and disease and natural disaster and so on. All that money could have been used for sustainable food, water, air, and energy sources. It's a viable question. Would humanity be better off if instead of looking to the potential of finding water and minerals on asteroids and Mars, we looked to Earth? I think these are important questions to ask, and I'm not saying I have the answer to them. But what we know for certain is that God calls us to promote human flourishing in the here and now. And so we have to ask that question. Has space exploration promoted human flourishing? There's all sorts of motivations that people have for exploring space. Certainly a company like SpaceX, it's a private company. They exist to make money. So do the space tourism companies. They will not exist if they don't make money. To create a company for the purpose of making money is normal. That is not wrong. That's just a normal business venture that happens in all sorts of ways. But when we do that, we need to examine the ethics of a company. Is it crossing a line to create companies for millionaires? In the process of serving those millionaires, and when we do that, we're wasting loads of natural resources for what amounts to a very brief pleasure ride. For example, should governments ban the $1.25 million spaceflight tickets to get on one of those New Shepard rides? Should we say that's such a waste of money and such a waste of resources, you're not allowed to do it? Could we even do that? Is it even possible? Could governments force millionaires and billionaires to use their money to help people in need? Or could governments impose a luxury tax that says, if you're going to pay $1.25 million to ride a 5-minute long space flight, you're also going to need to pay a 50% tax on that space flight, and that 50% will be given to social services agencies that benefit people in need on Earth. Maybe they could do that. Another way to look at it is this. Exploring the natural world can be an act of worship that glorifies God. When the act of exploration seeks to know the heart and mind of God. Throughout the centuries, Christians have been passionate about exploring new lands, new oceans, under the land, under the ocean, and the skies and the mountains, to the glory of God. And so turn with me to Psalm 19, page 439 in your pew Bibles. Psalm 19, page 439. Is it possible that space exploration, even though it's very expensive, may glorify God? Psalm 19 says this: the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, they use no words, no sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. In the heavens, God has pitched a tent for the sun. It is like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, like a champion rejoicing to run his course. It rises at one end of the heavens and makes its circuit to the other. Nothing is deprived of his warmth. Now there, when he says in verse 3, no sound of... Obviously, David was writing this psalm 3,000 years ago. He had no idea about radio waves that actually do come from outer space, that we can actually hear the stars and the other heavenly bodies. But that has only been made possible through space exploration. To David, the stars were quiet and distant, and that's okay. The point of this psalm is that just looking to the heavens can cause us to glorify God. I've shared this before. I love looking at the night sky. I get out there often when my dog has to go do his business and just look up at the sky. I love seeing the moon. I said this before, it freaks me out to think, oh my goodness, I can see this massive giant ball so clearly, and yet it's so far away. I don't know, something about that dynamic freaks me. But it reminds me, I think, of my smallness and God's unimaginable bigness. Turn to Psalm 8, verses 3 and 4. David writes this: when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. So if I get freaked out about the size of the moon and it helps me to understand my smallness, compare that to the size of the sun, which is unbelievably massive. And then think about the fact that the sun is not even a big star. And then think about all those distances of light years across the universe. We Christians would do well to explore space to worship God because of what it does. Now, I get it. Space exploration since the 1950s has not all been because people wanted to worship God. When we beat the Russians to the moon, how much of our motivation was simply because we wanted to be superior to the Russians? The race to the moon was, in some sense, a big ego contest. And it was super expensive. But my guess is that there are plenty of individuals who work for governments and space agencies who are doing it as an act of worship to the Lord. And in fact, these Psalms remind us that space exploration fits very nicely with the idea of work as worship. Because as we explore new worlds, we're seeking to know the mind of the creator of those new worlds. We want to know more of him and how and why he created, what motivated God to make something like the moon and the stars and Mars and so on. And so I think it is of great value for Christians to be people who gaze at the stars and the moon and other celestial events. Think about the recent eclipses. We've had a couple of just amazing eclipses in the last few years. These are opportunities to worship God. Romans 1:20, Paul writes this, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." Do you see what Paul is saying? We can know God by observing his handiwork. And as we explore space, we can actually know God better. That is, if we do it with a heart and mind to also care for our planet at the same time. I also want to point out that exploration of all kinds, over land, under the land, water, space, they have all led to advancement of humanity. Technology that has benefited humanity. Space exploration glorifies God because it has advanced human flourishing in so many ways. Let me ask you this question. Why do you like the Olympics? Just had the Olympics. Anybody want to say, why do you like the Olympics? Competition? The what? The action. It's exciting. What else? The accomplishments. Those athletes are just amazing. The Olympics have a depth about them that is really striking, particularly in our broken and divided world. The Olympics peacefully bring the world together. Space exploration does too. Even though the space race mimicked that ideological standoff between communism and democracy, things took a dramatic turn in the 1980s. In 1984, U.S. President Ronald Reagan authorized the beginning stages of creating an international space station. The design of it and building of the individual components took place between 1984 and 1993. It was a collaboration between the United States, Canada, Japan, and the European Space Agency. And then in 1993, they invited Russia to join with them. As I mentioned before, Russia had their own space stations, and eventually they actually built a big one. You remember what that name was? The big Russian space station? It's called Mir. It was in space from 86 to 2000 when eventually they allowed it to descend and burn up in the atmosphere. From 1995 to 1998, 36 space shuttle missions and 6 Russian rockets brought all the components of the International Space Station together in space. It took 250 spacewalks to build and maintain it. Since November 2000, the International Space Station has been continually inhabited by an international array of people from 5 agencies and 15 countries. NASA reports that the microgravity lab on the space station has hosted 3,000 research investigations and researchers supplying those investigations from over 108 countries. Though it all started off as a competition, a space race, one of the amazing aspects of the International Space Station is that it has been, like the Olympics, an amazing effort for peace. The International Space Station has promoted human flourishing in so many other ways as well. NASA reports that scientists and astronauts have done experiments and research on the ISS that have led to medical scanning technology advances, like ultrasound. They've created new drugs for muscular dystrophy. They have lowered heat in cities by analyzing it. They've tracked water. They applied air filtration techniques that had been used on the ISS for years to the COVID pandemic to help that. They have studied preserving food in grocery stores, creating artificial retinas, making cancer treatments simpler, monitoring heat safety on Earth, and more. The International Space Station, yes, it may have been very expensive, but it has also been an effort of space exploration for peace and unity and advancement of human flourishing that I think Christians can applaud. So for me, a theology of space exploration is a tension. On the one hand, it's very expensive. And it's hard to know if that is money well spent sometimes. But on the other hand, it has led to so many good things that glorify God, our Creator. Now, where do we go from here? You can choose where you want to fall in that tension, because I don't think there's any clear answer. Perhaps you can call your representative or senator, people in the government, to advocate for more money spent on NASA or less. More money spent on human agencies, less money spent on the moon. It's hard to know. But I hope these principles that we have looked at today might give us an opportunity to look at the mind of the Creator. That God created, He created it good, whether it's here on Earth or around the cosmos. And we can get to know Him. We can actually worship Him through space exploration. It's like I said in my Friday weekly email. If NASA had a competition for pastors and theologians to ride on a trip to Mars or the moon, I might go for it. I think that would be amazing. Well, this has been different. I hope in some way it's been informative, caused you to think. I hope maybe I've asked some questions that have gone a little deeper than before that you've ever encountered. But I hope that through it all, you can see that what we read in Scripture is that we are stewards of what is God's. No matter what we choose, we should glorify Him.